What's up guys, this is VinylicPuma and today I'd like to talk about an old fan theory that proposes the idea that the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim and Fallout 4 just so happen to take place within the exact same universe. Now before we start, it should be noted that in a GameSpot interview from last year, Pete Hines went ahead and pretty much squashed this theory by saying the following. I haven't the foggiest of notion of how anybody could make the leap that they are in fact part of the same thing. We made Elder Scrolls and a completely different developer and publisher came up with Fallout, which we then acquired. No, I don't think there's any universe in which those universes are in the same universe. That's not a thing. However, despite what Pete Hines says, I think the case that a lot of fans made at the time were based on some pretty good evidence, and I would argue that those people still have a case that both Fallout 4 and Skyrim could be connected and could potentially take place within the same universe. But before we go into that, let's go over some of the references, Easter eggs, and other evidence that seem to indicate this particular theory. If the player visits a location in Fallout 4 called Irish Pride Industries Shipyard, they can enter the facility and get onto a boat that's inside. And once you're on the boat, you can enter the boat's main cabin area, and on one of the tables, you should be able to pick up a copy of the Taboo Tattoos magazine. And if you look at the cover on the lower right corner, you're going to see what appears to be a skull design that features Skyrim's iconic iron helmet. Now, to see something like this in Fallout is pretty irregular, especially when you consider that Skyrim barely, if ever, references Fallout 3 or New Vegas. Another direct reference to Skyrim lies within Fallout 4's Nuka World DLC. When the player visits the DLC's Safari Adventure area, they can encounter a giant statue in the northern part of the area that resembles one of Skyrim's grizzly bears. It's pretty strange that this particular bear statue appears in Fallout 4. After all, Fallout 4's closest analog to the bear, which is the Yao Guai, looks a lot different. Granted, the Yao Guai, according to Fallout's lore, is supposed to be based off of the American black bear, which looks a lot different from the grizzly bear, but even still, this statue is pretty noteworthy and could suggest that Fallout 4 and Skyrim are linked. There is also a potential reference to Skyrim's Dwemer in Fallout 4. If you travel to Fallout 4's version of the custom house tower and you enter the door with the difficult to traverse stairs, you can enter a room that appears to have some statues of George Washington. However, if you look at the more central part of this small room and you look behind some of the objects here, you'll notice that there is a weird face statue here that kind of looks similar to the faces that appear on the Dwarven Centurions from Skyrim. Granted, the resemblance isn't identical in this case, but I think it's noteworthy as there is a possibility that Fallout 4's head statue may have been inspired by the design of the Dwarven Centurions from Skyrim. Perhaps one of the bigger pieces of evidence that suggests a link between Fallout 4 and Skyrim, though, is the reference to Nirnroot from the Elder Scrolls. If the player goes to the Pridwin and goes to the science or botany area that's located on the second or third floor, the player can observe and acquire an item called the experimental plant. While the experimental plant is blue and it isn't an exact copy of Skyrim's Nirnroot, it is worth mentioning that the botany terminal nearby indicates that both plants have very similar properties. For example, much like Nirnroot, Fallout 4's experimental plant exhibits bioluminescence or has the ability to glow. It has the ability to heal the player, and it also is worth mentioning that the experimental plant likes to grow close to bodies of water, much like Nirnroot does. And given the fact that all of these logs are titled with Experiment NRT-0001, this could also suggest that this particular plant is indeed Nirnroot from the Elder Scrolls series. Ultimately, while these four pieces of evidence vary in their significance to the same universe theory, they do suggest that there is a potential link between both Skyrim and Fallout 4. The appearance of Skyrim's grizzly bear and the experimental plant in particular are a pretty big deal, and certainly can't be thrown out as a mere coincidence. And I guess the question at this point is Skyrim's Nirn and Fallout's Earth one and the same? Going on what we're given, I suppose you could say that Skyrim's grizzly bear and the experimental plant would suggest that Earth could be the realm of Nirn from the Elder Scrolls. However, there are a number of problems you run into with this particular idea. Given that the events of the Fallout games take place on Earth, we know that Earth only has one moon, simply called the Moon. In the Elder Scrolls, Nirn has two moons, one of which is the large red moon called Masser, while the smaller gray moon is called Secunda. Not to mention that Secunda orbits Masser, and both moons are huge in Skyrim's night sky, which is totally unlike Earth. Of course, maybe Masser is actually Earth and Secunda is the Earth's moon, and somehow Nirn would be Mars, but even then, it doesn't seem possible that the Earth would appear so close to Nirn in the night sky, let alone orbit it. So I think we can establish that Earth and Nirn definitely aren't the same place. Despite that, though, this doesn't necessarily mean that they aren't in the same universe. After all, if you figure that our own Milky Way is estimated to have as many as 10 to 100 billion solar systems, and that there are as many as 100 to 200 billion galaxies in the entire universe, on the low end, that's about 1 sextillion solar systems, and on the high end, that's about 20 sextillion solar systems in the entire universe. And to give you an idea of how large of a number this is, it's theorized that all of the beaches across Earth have about 1 sextillion grains of sand. So I would say that the likelihood of a planet like Nirn existing in Fallout's universe isn't impossible. Granted, not all 1 to 20 sextillion solar systems in the universe are capable of supporting life, but only if a quintillion of them were, which is the estimated population of all insects on the planet, I'd still say it's certainly possible that there is a planet out there that's like Nirn that's being orbited by two moons that are arranged in a similar configuration. So the idea that you've seen online where Earth and Nirn might be the same place and that the events of Fallout took place first and then somehow the events of Elder Scrolls came after is incredibly unlikely, if not impossible. However, as I said, I don't think this would disqualify the planets of Earth and Nirn from being in the same universe. The thing is, this begs the question of how it's possible for both Skyrim and Fallout to share things like grizzly bears and Nirnroots, let alone how a fair amount of the plants and other fauna in the Elder Scrolls represent a lot of what we see here on Earth. Perhaps an answer to this question would be that beings capable of intergalactic travel brought these things from one planet to another. In other words, perhaps grizzly bears and other creatures and fauna were originally brought from Earth, while things like Nirnroots were originally brought from Nirn over to Earth. To be fair, I have to admit that I don't have a great explanation as to how grizzly bears and Nirnroot are shared between both the Earth and Nirn, but I do see how it could be possible. After all, if the laws of nature, physics, or science are consistent between both Earth and Nirn, and I have some reason to believe that they are to some extent, then I don't see how certain species from either planet couldn't coexist on the other, provided that the proper conditions to support life were present. Think about it. Humans and other mortal organisms in the Elder Scrolls breathe some type of atmosphere, and given that fire and water also exist in the Elder Scrolls universe, I would also assume that periodic elements like oxygen, hydrogen, and carbon exist as well. Therefore, I think it's fair to suggest that the same laws of physics, science, and/or nature that apply on Fallout's Earth also apply on Nirn, which would suggest that both reside within the same universe. Of course, this is leaving out a major thing that we also have to consider, which are the supernatural aspects of the Elder Scrolls universe. Not only do the Elder Scrolls games contain magic, which is non-existent in Fallout, but the way in which the Elder Scrolls games explain cosmology is far different. Specifically, what you might see as stars, planets, moons, and just the sky in Fallout are considered to be products of mortal mental stress in the Elder Scrolls universe. To go along with that, our perception of outer space in the Elder Scrolls series is just how mortals perceive Oblivion, while other planets like Akatosh, Kinnereth, Arkay, and Zenithar are gods and the planes of gods. Beyond Oblivion or outer space lies Aetherius, which is considered to be the immortal plane, the origin of magic, and is represented as the stars in the night sky. So even if things like carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen exist on both Fallout's Earth and the Elder Scrolls Nirn, the existence of magic and the supernatural in the Elder Scrolls surely confirms that both franchises aren't connected and aren't in the same universe, right? At first glance, this would appear to be the case. However, I think there are some other things that need to be considered. For starters, I think it's worth mentioning that despite Fallout's more grounded/real-world setting, it's not like the supernatural doesn't exist in any of the games. After all, if you've played through the Nuka World DLC and visited the Grantchester Mystery Mansion, there's a pretty good chance that you've encountered the spirit or ghost of Lucy that wanders the premises. Or even if you think about people like Lorenzo Cabot or Mama Murphy from Fallout 4. Lorenzo has enhanced strength and immortality, while Mama Murphy has unique foresight abilities that assist her in seeing the future. In fact, these foresight abilities that Mama Murphy has can be used during certain missions in Fallout 4 to make said missions easier. After all, how else would the sole survivor know the reset code to deactivate the Institute Corsair or have the ability to reduce the damage that they take from Kellogg? So clearly, there are supernatural phenomena that occur in Fallout that can't really be explained. And while I suppose things like Lucy from Grantchester Mansion or the visions that the player has at Dunwich Borers could be chalked up as being hallucinations or flashbacks of some sort, you can't really use a similar excuse to explain how Mama Murphy was able to literally see into the future. I also think the idea that the gods are planets isn't an entirely remote concept in Fallout either, as many of the planets in our own solar system, with the exception of Earth, are named after ancient Roman gods. Mercury was the winged god of travel, Venus was the Roman goddess of love, Mars was the god of war, Jupiter was the king of the gods, Saturn was the Roman god of architecture, Uranus was the Roman god of the sky, Neptune was the lord of the sea, and Pluto was the lord of the underworld. Plus, when you consider that the Imperials of Elder Scrolls are somewhat analogous to the Roman Empire, and that they worship the imperial pantheon of the 9 divines, 8 of which of those divines correspond to the god planets that surround Nirn, I think you can certainly see some correlation there. It's also worth considering that Aetherius has some parallels with Asgard from Norse mythology, specifically when it comes to Skyrim's Sovngarde being somewhat similar to Valhalla. Perhaps Asgard is the Fallout universe's parallel to the Elder Scrolls Aetherius, or perhaps it's possible that Asgard and Aetherius are different names for the exact same thing. So my theory would be that Nirn's and Earth's seemingly unique situations really aren't all that unique, and that it's part of a larger pattern that can be witnessed across their combined universe. In other words, there are other planets like Earth and Nirn that also have their own personalized set of gods and god planets and are connected to one immortal plane of existence like Aetherius, Asgard, Heaven, or whatever the societies that developed on said planet wish to call it. And while I must admit that it's more difficult to explain how the Elder Scrolls' various planes of Oblivion, like Mehrunes Dagon's Deadlands or Molag Bal's Cold Harbor, fit into this model, perhaps they exist in a capacity that's similar to the fiery realm of Muspelheim or the snow and ice realm of Niflheim from Norse mythology. It's an interesting idea, as there are a surprising number of similarities between Fallout and Elder Scrolls. Or maybe it's all just a simulation like The Matrix, and the appearance of Skyrim's Grizzly Bear or Nirnroot is nothing more than a glitch in the system. I guess to answer the question posed in this video's title, Skyrim and Fallout are certainly connected. And while Pete Hines may say that Fallout 4 and Skyrim aren't in the same universe, I don't see why they couldn't be. After all, both universes on their own are fictional, and while Fallout might be more grounded in reality, the Fallout games have always flirted with the supernatural, even when Interplay and Black Isle were publishing or working on the games. Perhaps the biased part of me, though, is hoping that Bethesda's currently unannounced Starfield will effectively link all of the current Bethesda game studios' game universes together in a way that blows people's minds. Having things linked together and explained in a crossover between Fallout, The Elder Scrolls, and Starfield could be pretty cool if done properly. And from a gameplay perspective, who wouldn't want to combine Skyrim's more sophisticated melee combat with Fallout 4's more sophisticated gunplay with space travel? I guess we'll see what happens, but before we go, and as a quick question to you guys, would you guys want to see an Elder Scrolls and Fallout crossover? Do you guys think that would be pretty cool, or do you guys think it would be stupid? Leave it in the comments below. Otherwise, like this video if you liked it, click the bell to join the notification squad, and as always, thank you all so much for supporting the channel. Take care, and I'll see y'all next time.